Good evening, everyone. This is the March 30th, 2022 meeting of the LUPS Committee. Welcome everyone who has been willing to wait for so long to see us on TV, and all together we'll try to be in our best behavior, which is very difficult for some of my fellow counselors. But we'll do the best we can. I call this meeting to order. This is the Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee of the City Council. All committee members are present today. Would you please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? The Pledge of Allegiance in English will be led by Councilor Sanchez, and the Pledge of Allegiance in Spanish will be read by Councilor Clarissa Pena. Thank you. Thank you all. This meeting is being held in the Vincent E. Griego Chambers, and public participation is via Zoom. Members of the public, city staff, and the media have the ability to view this meeting live through YouTube and Zoom webinar. The live stream can be accessed from both smartphones, tablets, or computers. For those watching on the live stream, thank you for joining us. Written comments were received for today's meeting and were provided to counselors. Members of the public have the opportunity to address the committee if they signed up for live public comment per the rules published on the agenda and on our website Friday. I'm sorry, I also forgot to mention that we are on Zoom, in case someone missed that. If you are watching the YouTube live feed for this meeting, please mute or turn it off when you are called upon to speak. We will call for the speakers when we get to the individual agenda item they signed up for. So here are the general public comment ground rules. Comments are to be addressed to the committee members only. Each participant has 2 minutes to present. Please keep your comments germane to the topics on the agenda, and any disruptive conduct will result in removal from the Zoom meeting room. There will be a 2-minute time limit when you are called upon to speak. The timer will start once you begin speaking, then the Zoom moderator, Mr. Moya, will let you know when your time is up. We will now go to public comment. Mr. Moya.
Madam Chair, I think you need to swear in some individuals that are signed up for public comment on a portion of these.
Okay, thank you. Would everyone, there's no one present, so do all of you swear to tell the truth? Yes. Thank you.
Madam Chair, the swearing in is for the public commenters who wish to speak to the cannabis regulations in Old Town.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I would suggest that we let Mr. Moya move those folks into the Zoom room, and then I believe it's scripted for you to ask them to raise their hand and swear in, and we can proceed with public comment after that.
Thank you so much. Mr. Moya.
Madam Chair, both the speakers are in the Zoom room, so if you can just read the swearing in on your script.
Thank you, please. And I don't have it on my script, but do you swear to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Sorry, my video isn't working, but I do. And I do.
Thank you. Okay, our first speaker is Sylvia Ramos Cruz. Your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you very much. I'm a property owner and resident of Old Town. I have previously submitted testimony in support of the cannabis-related amendments outlined in the Ideo for the Old Town HPO 5 zone. As you know, Old Town occupies an area of less than a mile, or about 10 city blocks. Though tiny, some have called this area the heart of Albuquerque, as it holds its history. It was founded in 1706 as Villa de Albuquerque in a pattern similar to all towns built by Spaniards around the world. Homes and businesses spreading out along narrow streets and alleys, please vote to add these amendments to the IDO. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jesse Ehrenberg. Jesse, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman and members of the committee. I have spoken on this issue before about the special place Old Town has in Albuquerque and the importance of maintaining it, both as a historical and a tourist location. As they say in business, image is everything, and Old Town has already suffered from businesses moving in with a very different vision on how it should be commercialized and what it should look like. As regards cannabis sales in Old Town, I have heard two main points. First, the fact that several new businesses have moved in selling alcohol and therefore selling cannabis is no different. Second, that selling cannabis will bring additional money into Old Town. Now, I have no arguments with this kind of reasoning if we were talking about an ordinary business district or a shopping center. There, they would be welcome to sell cannabis, discount liquor, or put in a dollar store. But Old Town is not ordinary. It's billed as historic Old Town. And that's why it's Albuquerque's main tourist destination, a place where parents can feel comfortable bringing their children and family. So for all these reasons, I feel the sale of cannabis in Old Town should be prohibited, and I hope you will all vote for Bill R21-165. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madam Chair, we'll now move on to public speakers that signed up for general citywide changes. And our first speaker is Rhiannon Samuel. Rhiannon, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Rhiannon Samuel, and I represent NAOP, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association for the city. I want to speak in support of A11 and A10, both of which are good for development, pro-economic development in our city, and we think they need to pass as is. The one that I just think deserves more conversation is A2, the hotel conversions to residential uses for affordable housing. NAOP strongly supports the intention of this bill. As many of you already know, there's a shortage of housing options for residents in our city, both low income and affordable, and this bill will help get more folks housed. The challenge with this bill and the two amendments that are being brought forth tonight, the two options, is that we're getting in our own way and getting people housed. One amendment has that the funding is contingent, or the parameters of this is contingent on funding coming from family and community services. The other is contingent on having supportive resources and services provided to the residents. Now, this really indicates that if somebody has less than a full kitchen, then they need supportive services. And what we're finding in the residents that use these hotel conversion units is that some simply don't cook, they don't have a need for a large kitchen, and so we want to make sure that we have housing options available to anyone and everyone. So thank you for your support of A10 and A11, and we hope that there is more discussion on A2.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Bradley Day. Bradley, please feel free to turn your video on, and your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking. Bradley Day, are you there? There you go.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay. Thank you, councilors, for your attention. I am speaking on behalf of the Safe Outdoor Spaces, which is an amendment that will finally give homeless individuals who are trespassing on public and private property a viable alternative.
there's no place to go except down the street and trespass again. The Safe Outdoor Spaces solves this trespassing problem for the homeless and the city and the county. In addition, the homeless people who reside in these safe outdoor spaces will have a legal base to work from because they can shower, they can use the bathroom, they can do their laundry, they can store their belongings and lock them up, they can receive mail, and they can get the help they need to get things like identification cards, help with Social Security, and referrals to services they require. And that is what a safe outdoor space will do. Without a base of operations like that, getting a job is extremely problematic. So the bottom line is, tents to rents is the motto of the safe outdoor spaces. And I hope that you will approve that. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Martin Baca. Martin, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Good evening, Madam Chair and City Councilors. My name is Martin Baca. I'm a lifelong resident of Albuquerque. I've also been a manager in the South Surf car wash industry for over 20 years. I'm speaking to oppose Amendment A1, limiting car wash operating hours, due to the amendment being very vague and unfairly attacking the South Surf car wash industry. My understanding is that this amendment was written to prevent loitering. The way the amendment is written, it does not address loitering. It does, however, limit the operating hours of only one type of business in the Albuquerque area. This amendment should be written in a way that targets the persons who are committing the loitering, not written to impact existing businesses. Loitering occurs all over the city, and closing a business is not going to make it go away. What complaints is APD receiving that they would have to legally remove anyone from these properties? Is it one person detailing his car for too long, or is it several people being too loud? If it's a noise issue, it should be dealt with as a noise issue. If it's a person hanging out too long, what concern of the neighborhood is it affecting? How many calls of loitering is APD receiving on a weekly basis? Is it related to one business location? If so, the city needs to work with that business to prevent any illegal activity. Our equipment is not designed to be turned on and off every night and every morning. Even so, closing at 10 p.m. and remaining closed until 7 a.m. is very extreme. This would be a huge impact for the South Surf car wash industry and our customer base that uses our facilities at night, for example, construction companies, customers who work swing shifts. Please target the crime in the city, not the business owners, employees, and citizens. I am opposed to Amendment A1 car wash operating hours. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Peter Kalitzis. Peter, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking. Yes, please proceed, Peter. Can hear you.
Madam Chair and committee members, my name is Peter Kalitzis, and I am in support of increased sleeping opportunities for the in-house. Regarding the campgrounds and religious institutions, on page 4 of 21 of the list made to EPC on December 9th, I support the EPC recommendations that provide for encampments as an incidental use be permitted throughout the city at religious institutions. In addition, I request the inclusion of trauma-informed capacity
Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Buck. Michael, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Hi, my name is Michael Buck. I'm the New Mexico State Supervisor with DECO North America. I'm speaking in opposition of the amendment to limit car wash hours. We don't have a loitering problem at any of our car washes. If you close down our business where no one is on site, you would definitely have a loitering problem. It will be dark and deserted, and that will promote more crime in the area. If there is a loud noise coming from a particular car wash, then they should get a ticket for disturbing the peace. I think it's unfair to focus on car washes, and it's very un-American to shut down an entire industry based on noise complaints. Vandalism and robberies will definitely go up if we have no customers on property. 30% of our business is revenue is from business between 10 and 7 o'clock in the morning. Every business has a loitering problem. I can get police reports on all businesses from having loitering problems. I just think it's very unfair to single out car washes. That's all I have to say. Appreciate your time. You guys have a great night.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Avery Volkman. Avery, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you, council members and Madam Chair, for this time being able to speak. I appreciate your time in this matter, a matter which directly affects myself, my family, and many businesses throughout the Albuquerque area. My name is Avery Volkman, and I'm an owner and operator of car washes. And I'd like to say that I am against the new proposed amendment A1, limiting car wash operating hours, for all the reasons that I presented in the March 15th, 2022 meeting. And I'd like to highlight a few more now. As it stands, the A1 car wash operating hours is unreasonable, unnecessary, and hurtful to many Albuquerque businesses. The city of Albuquerque already has a no trespassing ordinance and a noise ordinance, which are 12-2-3 and 12-2-4 respectively, with penalties already in the books for those who violate these ordinances. This new proposed amendment would be trying to accomplish the same thing as those two previous ordinances, which are to limit people who are not supposed to be there. It seems through this ordinance that our businesses, which are car washes, self-serve car washes, are being singled out unfairly, and it is alluding that we are the reason why people gather. However, I went around and looked at other 24-hour businesses on a Friday night, like Walmart's, McDonald's, and even my car wash late at night, and there were far more people gathering at a Walmart and McDonald's than at my car wash. Not only is this new proposed ordinance hard to enforce and vague, but as I mentioned in the previous meeting, it's something that we physically cannot do because our hardware and software has limitations. Simply put, it would be very difficult and cause damage to our systems to close down and open our car wash every day, as it is not designed to do that. Also, car washes are not the cause of people gathering. If we are closed, these people will find another place to gather. There are many other 24-hour businesses and empty parking lots throughout Albuquerque where people are doing the same thing. Please don't pass Amendment A1, and I'm available to discuss any questions that you have later. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jane Beckel. Jane, your 2 minutes begin when you start speaking.
Thank you. Madam Chair and councilors, yesterday I submitted written comments from the Santa Fe Village Neighborhood Association, again outlining some of our opposition to the selected amendments to the Ideo. The Santa Fe Village Neighborhood Association has participated in this 2021 Ideo amendment process beginning in last fall. I attended planning department meetings outlining the proposed amendments, the EPC committee meeting in December, and now the MOPS committee meetings. We have really devoted time to trying to accurately understand these proposals and their impact. What I want to say is we stand opposed. Our opposition is based on our analysis that these amendments, as currently proposed, conflict with purpose and policy statements of the Ideo and the ABC comp plan, most notably protecting underserved, under-resourced areas of the city, equity, and genuine public engagement. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Brasher. Michael, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Yesterday I submitted written comments from the Santa Fe Village Neighborhood Association, again outlining some of our opposition to the selected amendments to the Ideo. The Santa Fe Village Neighborhood Association has participated in this 2021 Ideo amendment process beginning in last fall. I attended planning department meetings outlining the proposed amendments, the EPC committee meetings in December, and now the MOPS committee meetings. We have really devoted time to trying to accurately understand these proposals and their impact. What I want to say is we're standing opposed. Our opposition is based on our analysis that these amendments, as currently proposed, conflict with purpose and policy statements of the Ideo and the ABC comp plan, most notably protecting underserved, under-resourced areas of the city, equity, and genuine public engagement. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Brasher. Michael, your 2 minutes will begin when you start spe Thank you. Our next speaker is Gillum Curley. Gillum, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you, council members. I submitted some written comments earlier today which compare the state outdoor space and temporary campground proposals on a line-by-line basis. Hopefully you'll have an opportunity to look at those if you haven't already, and happy to answer any questions. I want to use my time tonight to make some more general comments. The biggest mistake that we make in addressing the homelessness crisis is to assume that homeless people are homogeneous and to create one-size-fits-all solutions. We need a variety of solutions tailored to a wide variety of homeless people. I believe that the state outdoor space proposal does this. It provides flexibility to have different types of spaces for different types of homeless people with different needs and different abilities. What we have now as the status quo is for people who are not able to go to shelter because of mental health issues, past experiences, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of reasons. What we have as the status quo is an unauthorized, unregulated, and unmanaged land use, urban campgrounds. But it's a persistent, intractable land use that is spread all across the city, popping up on sidewalks, parks, underpasses, wherever there's a space that someone feels that they may be able to spend a night or two before being cleared away. This will provide our neighborhoods and businesses with a reduction in this population that's unauthorized use, would reduce the city's costs in clearing campus and managing those problems, and it provides homeless people with a safer, more stable environment that works for them and helps them to stabilize.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Your time is up. Thank you. Our next speaker is Patricia Wilson. Patricia, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Madam Chair and committee members, I am addressing the citywide text amendments only. Last Friday, I sent you a document, just referenced by Michael Brasher, which had received unanimous support at the previous day's Inter-Coalition Council meeting. A proposal to amend the citywide text amendment process. While it may not be ready for prime time, perhaps it will start the conversation regarding metrics to determine if an update is textual or substantive. I agree with the need for substantive amendments. Page 2 of this bill speaks to the requirement to respond to changes in demands for housing and business needs. The amendments here related to hotel conversions, cottage development, safe outdoor spaces, and temporary campgrounds do just that. But the community needs more time and more planning staff available to review substantive changes. Specifically, I oppose A10, Councilor Lewis's amendment to strike climactic and geographic responsiveness. You've already received my written comments regarding staff's explanations. Why remove it after only 1 year? Are developers complaining about having to fill out another form? Builders in the Southwest have been paying attention to sun angles since they were living in caves. It's not rocket science. Councilor Benton has told me more than once you cannot legislate good design, but I believe you can make it harder to do bad design. Anyone involved with the built environment should be embarrassed to create work that does not respond to climate and geographic features. Please do not pass A10. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Leslie Padilla. Leslie, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking. Leslie, you are muted.
Thank you, council members. I have come rather late to try to study the IDEO amendment
Thank you. Our next speaker is Peggy Neff. Peggy, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Good afternoon, councilors. I begin again asking respectfully that you, Madam Chair, Councilor Jones, and Councilor Benson, recuse yourself from any vote on all matters pertaining to the IDO. I believe that your history with this ordinance presents a serious debate and discussion. I think that there's a conflict of interest in respect to this zoning matter. Respectfully, I do not believe that you can act impartially. Furthermore, I support the request from the Inner Coalition Council and those who have spoken in regard to it, where our community has asked for clarity in the ideal update process. There is a difference between substantive and textual/technical amendments. The process was supposed to address technical and textual amendments so that the multiple, gigantic process of taking all of our sector plans and all of our previous zoning laws into one ordinance could be easily amended because sometimes things fall through the cracks. To bring substantive amendments in through this process has created a haphazard process. Land use matters are supposed to be steady and predictable. This amendment process is putting the city at risk. I do not believe that you should carry on forward with these amendments as you have them. There is no way for the community to be involved in 66 plus 18 plus whatever more you bring to the table next meeting. It is wrong. Substantive issues like housing for millennials need a better process. Substantive measures like walkability need a better process. We need a better process to fully discuss and plan for substantive amendments. We don't have that process in place. We need that process. To begin that process,
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you. Your time is up. Our next speaker is Sandra Perea. Sandra, your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Oh, okay. All right. Rachel, we'll hear from you next. Please feel free to turn your video back on, and your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to speak. I support the comments of Mr. Kalitzis and Ms. Padilla and the submission of the PHNA written comments that were submitted. My name is Rachel Baca, and I'm the president of the Siesta Hills Neighborhood Association. The residents of our neighborhood are proud of their history and connection to the legacy of Dr. Lovelace, Kirtland Air Force Base, and the Sandia Laboratories, and their place in the development of Albuquerque as a city. We have developed an alliance with the neighborhood associations of Parkland Hills and Elder Homestead over the past 2 years as we have worked together to monitor the city's purchase of the old Lovelace Hospital property and now the development of an operation plan for the proposed Gateway Center as an overnight homeless shelter. It has been a trial by fire as we have had to pull ourselves away from our jobs and families to dive headlong into the inner workings of city regulations and countless hearings and meetings. Our dedication has been rooted in our common goal to protect our neighborhoods, to keep them from being the concentrated dumping ground for lofty projects that fail, leaving us to sweep up the pieces of our parks, businesses, and homes. We support the EDC's recommendation that MX-H stays conditional and MX-M be added as conditional use for overnight shelters. Adding MXM for overnight shelters will add so many more opportunities to help people experiencing homelessness throughout the city. But we support keeping the conditional use stipulation. As it stands, the conditional use status for overnight shelters has made it necessary within the process for the process has not been easy, and we are still fighting for transparency and impact studies and capacity limits and legally binding good neighbor agreements. But at least we had the chance to fight for our neighborhood.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Your time is up. Our next speaker is Sandra Perea. Your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Good evening, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Sandra Perea, and I am the president of the Alder Homestead Neighborhood Association, although I will be speaking for myself this evening. I do speak today in support of the Park and Hills Neighborhood Association that was submitted on March the 12th. I also concur with the testimony today that was given by Rachel Baca, the president of the Siesta Homes Neighborhood Association, and the written testimony of Peter Calixis that he gave today. Again, this is support adding that MSM as a conditional use permit and keeping the MSH as a conditional use permit for overnight shelters. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Madam Chair, that'll conclude public comments.
Thank you, Mr. Moya, and thank you all. Next, we're going to agenda item A. Councilor Benton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Agenda item A is 010. This is sponsored by myself and yourself. Adopting the citywide text amendments to the Integrated Development Ordinance 14-16 for the 2021 Ideo annual update, and adopting text amendments for a small mapped area, the Old Town Historic Protection Overlay Zone, HPO 5. I move a do pass.
I'll second that. And councilors, at this point, we will begin with a presentation on this legislation by city staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this point, you do need to swear in any city staff who will be speaking to this item because of the quasi-judicial nature of the changes to Old Town.
Thank you. Would any city staff that's planning and talking to this, please raise your right hand? Thank you, city staff. Do you promise to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Okay, councilors, hello. This is the second Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee hearing on the proposed changes to the Integrated Development Ordinance for the 2021 Ideo Annual Update. The beginning of my presentation will look very similar to the presentation you saw 2 weeks ago. We will then move into some individual slides on the 20 amendments before you. After I give a brief overview of an amendment, I will pause. The committee can deliberate, and if the sponsor so chooses, they might move that amendment, but we'll take them one at a time if that's the pleasure of the committee. So here is an update or a timeline of the update so far. In September of 2021, all the amendments were distributed to the public for their review. These are the amendments that the planning department had compiled since the last update over the summer, during the fall, to propose to the EPC later on in the winter. In October of 2021, the department held public meetings and open houses to discuss those amendments. They invited members of the public to give their input on the proposal at hand that would be heading to EPC, take feedback, hear about new amendments, really try to engage with the public on what was going to be proposed. In December of 2021, the Environmental Planning Commission, or the EPC, held their first and only hearing on the matter. They unanimously ended up recommending approval to the City Council. In February, the Planning Department transmitted the packet over to the City Council for introduction through the regular process. That leads us to March of 2022, where we are now in the Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee process, where the subcommittee of the council first hears the proposed changes, might pose their new amendments before recommending up to the full council action on the item. At some point in the future, the full council will consider any amendments you might pass tonight or at a future LEPS hearing, and will have an opportunity to amend the bill as well. Worth noting is that the EPC heard two separate applications at their December hearing. excuse me, one was for proposed changes to the Old Town Historic Protection Overlay Zone, that's HPO 5, related to some proposed cannabis regulations. You've heard public comment about that today. The second application is a legislative action and applies citywide and proposes more general changes to the document. You've heard public comments on both the citywide and the HPO 5 amendments. Public comment received since the EPC made their decision in December is listed on this slide. At your last hearing, you heard from about 19 members of the public who spoke about a variety of topics. Tonight, I think you heard from about 17 or 18 folks as well. And in your iPads, you will have about 41 written comments that have been collected from both the March 16th hearing and tonight's March 30th hearing. I've listed the topics that folks commented on, and it's nearly every amendment that the council is proposing tonight, with the exception of a few. I will quickly review the proposed changes to Old Town. This is the quasi-judicial portion of the packet that proposes to implement some regulations for cannabis uses in the area. The map that I'm showing on the screen is the HPO 5 boundary, and the proposal before you tonight is to prohibit any type of cannabis retail, cannabis cultivation, or cannabis-derived products manufacturing within that area. Generally, the EPC received comments of support for that proposal, and they did unanimously recommend to the City Council that that proposal be approved. Moving on to the citywide regulations. Councilors, here's where we will get into the individual amendments that have been sponsored. Those are listed A1 through A20. Members of the public will note that the packets they're likely viewing go to A17. There were some last-minute amendments posed this afternoon that are posted on the ABC-Zone website. If those members of the public would like to follow along, they can go to that website to access the newest packet that came out around 4 o'clock today. Okay, Amendment A1. This amendment is not going to be moved by the sponsor. This related to additional regulations for self-serve car wash establishments. You heard public comment about this today. Staff has heard from members of APD that this amendment is not needed to accomplish what we were hoping to accomplish, to address trespassing on these establishments. And if we don't need to have regulations in our zoning code, there's no need to move the amendment. Councilors, are there any questions about an amendment that will not be moved? Okay, Amendment A2. This amendment proposes to allow a kind of special procedure for the conversion of non-residential uses to residential uses. I'd like to be clear about something that is maybe not clear in the packet. Non-residential uses can be a variety of things. I think generally, and at the last meeting, we talked a lot about hotels and motels. However, non-residential uses is more than just hotels or motels. That could be office spaces, it could be warehouses, it could be industrial areas. I know the narrative has primarily focused on hotels and motels, but the way the amendment is written, it would cover all non-residential uses. I'd like to be clear about that so the council can be clear about what they might be adopting. The purpose of this amendment would be to allow the conversion of a non-residential use to a residential use to provide a lesser kitchen. Today in the Ideo, there's a pretty explicit definition for what a kitchen has to require. That would be a sink of adequate size to wash hands or dishes, and a full oven, range, or stove. This amendment would allow a hot plate or a microwave in lieu of that full oven, range, or stove. And I believe that we have representatives from the Department of Family and Community Services here who initially asked for this amendment. If there are questions from the committee about the purpose of the amendment, how the department expects this amendment to kind of play out in the real world, I would invite the committee to ask those members to come down to speak.
Councilors, are there any questions? Councilors? Give us just a second. Thank you.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I will note that you have 3 competing amendments in your packet for this topic. There was originally one proposal at the March 15th LEPS hearing, and Staff has been given direction to draft 3 kind of different versions of this idea. Not all 3 of these ideas can be adopted. They would be in conflict with each other, so I would be happy to describe the difference. And at some point, the council will need to determine which version they would like to adopt.
Thank you. Councilor Sanchez, did you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just sitting here thinking if we have 3 different versions, maybe we should make a motion to defer this one so that we can actually work it through a little better.
Madam Chair, if there's interest in not taking action on any particular amendment tonight, that would not necessarily require a motion to defer, and you would just not move to adopt that amendment. When we're ready to defer, the whole bill will need to be deferred, but individual amendments do not need to be deferred if there is not a motion on the floor.
Councilor Sanchez?
I'd like to look at it further, maybe have more discussion in reference to all these. That way we can maybe come together, make a better decision.
Thank you. Councilor Benton?
Yes, I'd like to hear the difference between the 3 before we do anything or not do anything.
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, sure. I've outlined the kind of highlights on the slide here for you. There's the original requirement as the proposal was first submitted required that these projects, these conversions of non-residential uses to residential uses, could only implement the lesser kitchen requirement if they were associated with funding from the Department of Family and Community Services. That is to say that there would be some kind of affordable housing dollars associated with the project to maintain the affordable housing element to the project. So option 1 still requires that partnership with the city stay intact, but it would limit the occupancy of the units based on the number of bedrooms. And I believe in the amendment, it would limit the occupancy to 1 person for an efficiency unit, 2 people for a 1-bedroom unit, and 4 people for a 2-bedroom unit. Option 2 has all the same base requirements as the bill as it was proposed on March 15th, but it would strike the requirement that city funding be associated with the project. This would allow any developer to take a non-residential use and convert it to a residential use with the lesser kitchen requirement without the use of any kind of city funding or affordable housing dollars. Option 3, again, would still require the city funding be intact, but would require that full kitchens be installed within 2 years of that residential use receiving its certificate of occupancy. So that's to say that they would get a pass for a lesser kitchen for 2 years, but after that 2-year mark, they would need to install full kitchens. These are 3 different approaches to the same idea, and staff would really appreciate any kind of deliberation or direction on which option the council might want to go with.
Sure.
Yes.
Ms. Schultz, so I was involved in option 1, discussing that, and the issue of number of bedrooms. So essentially, with a total occupancy of 4, if I understood that correctly, you still would not have to have a full kitchen.
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, the occupancy is not related to the lesser kitchen requirement. The lesser kitchens could be required or are allowed no matter the occupancy. This just dictates how big the units are, would determine how many people can stay in those units.
Oh, so that's separate from the kitchen issue.
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, yes, that's true, and I believe staff is asking you to move a little bit closer to your microphone.
Okay. Well, I think the issue here is when we go beyond 1 or 2 people in one of these dwelling units, I mean, the likelihood that somebody needs to actually prepare food for someone else or for themselves in the unit does increase. And I'm concerned about doing essentially 2-bedroom apartments that could sleep numerous people and not having an actual kitchen, essentially, being reliant on a hot plate or something like that, or a microwave. So, I think in these emergency situations where the Department of Family and Community Services is involved, I think we can kind of keep a grip on that situation as far as what's developed through just administratively through the city and its administration. but I am concerned about broadening this. And I think, there are some basic housing code requirements that we ought to be looking at as well. We talked about that. The housing code is separate from the IDO, but is relevant here. I think this is an important discussion. I do want to facilitate these motel conversions, but I start to get concerned when we start talking about 2 and 3 bedroom apartments, numerous people in them, and being reliant on a hot plate or a microwave for your food preparation.
Councilors, any other questions?
Yes, Madam Chair. I have a couple of things on this. I kind of worked with this extensively with some of the folks that went into my office, and we talked a little bit about it. And I have some questions about receiving funding through the City of Albuquerque Department of Family and Community Services in reference to these units. And the questions I have is, are we just limiting to funding through the City of Albuquerque? Is this going to be or can this be a private endeavor? And the funding, where's the funding coming from? I also wanted to know, is this going to just be conversions only, or also, and not new builds? What are we looking at here?
Madam Chair, Councilor Sanchez, I might ask someone from the department to come down and answer your question specific to the funding, but I can go ahead and answer your second question, which was about, is this only relevant to conversions, or could new construction take advantage of the lesser kitchen requirements? And the way the amendment is written, it would have to be an existing non-residential use, i.e. an existing building, who could take advantage of what this would allow. So a new build would not be allowed to do this.
Okay. And then the other question that I had in reference to that is, I basically feel that it's more important to have a refrigerator, and nowadays you can actually get by with a hot plate, a microwave, and probably an air fryer. But I think a refrigerator is probably a little bit more important and probably should be provided. Maybe some sort of trade-off there. So I think there's quite a bit more discussion that we need to do in reference to this.
Madam Chair, Councilor Sanchez, there is a requirement in the amendment that a refrigerator must be provided, so that is an existing requirement. But I will defer to the folks at the Department of Family and Community Services to answer your questions about funding.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hvala.
Madam Chair, Councilor
Thank
Sanchez.
you for joining us and
Thank
helping.
you. Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me here. So the funding sources that the Department of Family and Community Services currently has available for these types of projects are HUD dollars, specifically HUD home dollars, and also HUD Community Development Block Grant dollars could be used for this. And we have our local workforce housing trust fund dollars. Typically, what we do is we contract with a local nonprofit developer with these dollars to develop affordable housing. So the city typically doesn't do the project ourselves. We contract with a local developer, nonprofit developer, to construct or acquire and rehab affordable units.
Okay, and I'm new at this. Is it private or just the city can provide it?
The city, I think, Councilor Sanchez, you're asking about option number 1. The way that is worded is it would be limited to projects that receive funding through the Department of Family and Community Services. So the projects would be completed by a private entity, by a nonprofit developer. But in order to be eligible for this exemption, they would have to receive public funding through the Department of Family and Community Services.
Okay, alrighty, I gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Ms. Hvala, I think I've heard some questions about the number of occupants in the different size units.
Yes, and I don't have a copy of that amendment that talks about the occupancy standards. I think there was some discussion about this that I had with one of the counselors about just wanting to make sure that there was an appropriate number of people living in the unit depending on the unit size. So if it's an efficiency apartment, we'd want to make sure there's not 3 people living in that unit. So setting some occupancy standards would be a reasonable way to go about that. And also in line, like the Albuquerque Housing Authority has occupancy standards. This is a standard way of making sure there's appropriate number of people living in a unit.
And may I assume that you will give to us a briefing on some of this when it comes before full council so we can ask the questions and get specific answers on these?
Absolutely. I would be happy to do that.
Thank
And
you,
then-
ma'am. Yes, Councilor Sanchez.
Madam Chair, thank you, Ms. Huval. Got another question in reference. This looks like option 2.
Okay.
And number 4 states an agreement providing a minimum of 40 hours of support services will be provided to residents, and shall be let me read that again. An agreement providing that a minimum of 40 hours of support services will be provided to residents shall be provided with application materials. So I don't understand that. What kind of services are going to be provided? Who pays for the services? How long will those services take to get taken care of? Those are some of the questions I have. It doesn't say anything about where those services or the funding for the services come from.
Madam Chair, Councilor Sanchez, thank you for that question. I know this was language that was added to the second version of the amendment, so I can give you my interpretation of how I read this. In my mind, this would be essentially requiring someone be on site at least 40 hours a week to provide a basic level of service coordination to the residents living at the property. So, for example, if someone was having trouble, had run out of money and couldn't buy food, or they were having a mental health crisis, or they were having trouble paying their rent, this would be a person that they could go to on site to say, I'm struggling, I need some help. Also, the on-site service coordinator could keep an eye on folks too. If they didn't see a resident for a couple days, they could kind of check on them, make sure that they were okay. That was, I think, that's how I interpret this, although I understand that it's not written exactly that way. And I think it would be on the developer or the owner of the property to figure out how to fund those services.
Okay, just curious is the developer going to want to jump into that kind of obligation? So there's still a lot of questions to be answered in reference to that amendment.
Madam Chair, Councilor Sanchez, I mean, I don't know if there's a lot of developers that will want to take on that obligation. I think our nonprofit developers that provide affordable housing to low and moderate income folks, some of those developers do provide on-site service coordinators at their property. So for them, this is not a totally unusual model.
Mm-hmm.
But for other for-profit developers or just regular landlords or owners of these buildings, this would be, I'm not sure what the interest will be in doing this.
And 40 hours of service, who determines when the 40 hours is over? And I'm just curious as to where the providers come from, the city as well? Is that where they come from, and that's who's paying for them? We are?
Madam Chair, Councilor Sanchez, the requirement in the amendment is that just the agreement be provided to the planning department at the time that the application comes through to do this conversion. So the department would not necessarily be, going out and seeing who's on the clock. Are they on the clock for 38 hours a week, for 42 hours a week? We're asking for the agreement where the property owner is committing to this.
Okay. I just have a lot of questions in reference to that section. It's very, very vague. And I think we need to look at that a little bit more.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Pena, and then Councilor Fibecorn.
Madam Chair, I think we go back to what we were talking about initially is just hearing these amendments later so we have an opportunity to talk to the staff, to talk to other councilors, to see if we can all kind of get on the same page. I know this is permanent housing, so we just have to make sure that we do our due diligence to make sure that we're just not warehousing people. And then if there's a potential for family members to be with young children to be housed in these hotel rooms, that we make sure that we're providing the services needed and to ensure that they're able to have access to good meals in terms of preparation and not just fast food and, microwave items. So that's all I had to add, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. And Counselor Fieberkorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to respond to Councilor Sanchez's question. I think it's important to remember that this was supposed to be somewhat transitional housing, right? It's not that we're putting people in these places forever. It's a step above where they are maybe likely coming from. And the reason that Amendment 2 was put in there that has that requirement for services to be provided if it's developed by a developer is because we heard at the last LUPS meeting from quite a few developers that they were interested in doing this kind of project. And so I wanted to open it up to allow that to be done by the market rather than by the city. But I want to make sure that if we're doing that, that the people living in these units still get the services that we were going to be providing if it was a city project. And so that was the point of having the services requirement if a developer does this project. So I'm open to the conversation. I'd really like to have further conversations on it, but that's the rationale behind at least that part of option 2.
Thank you, Counselor. And I believe our intent tonight is to listen to all of this and ask questions as we like, but we'll probably hear most of this again for full council.
Madam Chair, that's the purview of the committee. That you are welcome to move and vote on any amendments you choose tonight. If there are some that aren't ready, I would probably encourage you to not move on those. But you have the option to either keep this in the LUPS committee for another hearing if you feel like some of these need to be massaged by the smaller version of the council first, or you also have the option to move the bill out tonight as well.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. And I know you have more to talk about. Are there any other questions on these particular top 3 options here? Yes, Councilor Pena.
So just for clarification, I know Councilor Fieberkorn just stated that it was for transitional, but I was of the understanding that this is for permanent housing.
Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, I might ask the department who initially drafted the original version of this amendment to kind of talk about their intentions about transitional versus permanent housing.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, thank you. Yes, this is permanent housing. I think the idea is folks can live in this housing. It's an apartment that they'll rent. They can live there as long as they want to. I think our hope and expectation is that folks who are living there, the opportunity to live in a safe and stable place will allow them to take care of themselves and become more stable. And over time, hopefully folks will move on to other types of permanent housing as well. But there won't be a time limit on how long folks can stay.
Thank you, Ms. Hall and Madam Chair. So if I could just add to that, hence kind of why I really want us to make sure that we do our due diligence if this is going to be considered permanent housing, that we make sure that we have the wraparound services and, access to nutritious meals for kids and that being not just the microwave. So thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Sanchez, did you have another question?
Yeah, I'd be happy to actually table this for a while and get together with everybody so that we can make sure that we're doing the right thing for the folks that are in there.
Thanks, your Counselor Sanchez, and I think we're going to hear the rest of the presentation. And Ms. Schultz seems to be very amenable to our interrupting her and asking questions whenever we want. So this is a good time to forage out some of the questions that we might have and then expand on them again. Thank you, Ms. Schultz. If you'd like to continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, councilors, for the discussion on A2. I know that's a complicated one, and you've given us a lot to think about as staff, and we will certainly be in touch before the next meeting, whether that's LUPS or full council, to see what we can do for you in terms of an amendment. Okay, with that said, we will move on to Amendment A3. Amendment A3 proposes to amend the calculation for cottage development. Sorry, I'm getting to that page in my packet. Today, when you want to develop cottage development, you have to do a semi-complicated formula, and the Ideo today directs you to either round up or round down at a certain point in that formula. Council staff did some research on the adoption of the Ideo and when cottage development came to be in the document, and the council adopted no such direction to round up or round down. That was kind of an administrative direction the planning department took to specify that there was going to be rounding in that equation. This amendment proposes to delete the requirement to round, to say that you can use fractions of numbers in that calculation, which still comes out to a completely acceptable end result to determine how much square footage of a building you can have on a lot in cottage development. And counselors, I'm happy to answer questions about this, but this is also an opportunity to move and vote on amendments if the committee is feeling that there aren't questions, or if they're comfortable with the amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. And counselors, if you would like to, if you'd like to make a motion to vote on this one, on the A3, we certainly can at this meeting.
Sure. Do we usually move the entire bill forward without the voting on the amendments? We don't, do we? I'm getting myself.
I think we have to vote
confused.
on each amendment, and some of the amendments are going to be moved on to
Full council
full council
without. Okay. Well, I'd make a motion to, for committee amendment number 3.
Counselors, any comments? There's a motion and a second for committee amendment number 3.
Madam Chair, just to be clear, this is Committee Amendment 1, labeled A3.
Correct.
Sorry for the confusion on the two
that's
different numbering
sorry.
systems, but this is the first committee amendment.
Great. Are we ready to vote on that if no one has any comments? All right. There's a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Please
Madam
raise your hands because they have to take account. Yes. Opposed? The motion carries unanimously.
Great, thank you, counselors.
Thank you.
We will move on to Amendment A4, which is also related to cottage development. This amendment proposes to allow, again, talking about that formula that a property owner uses to determine how much square footage of building they can have in cottage development. In the R1D lot, which is our largest R1 lot, there is A, B, C, and D. Those get progressively larger from A to D. R1D is the largest lot. This proposes to add a special kind of provision for the R1D lot that you can do a multiplier of 2,600, which would be different than the multiplier you would be able to do in R1A, B, and C, to acknowledge that the R1D lots, as they are the biggest in the city, may be able to accommodate more building square footage.
Thank you. Are there any questions on this one?
No. Madam Chair, I'd like to make a motion for committee amendment number 2. For
Yeah.
approval.
There is, and a second, I'll second that. There's a motion and a second for committee A4, right?
Madam Chair, Committee Amendment 2.
Amendment 2, item A4. All right. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you, counselors. We will move on to LEP's amendment labeled A5. This is a kind of bundle of changes to cannabis provisions in the IDO. If you'll recall, last year during the IDO annual update, the council amended in a regulatory framework, a zoning framework for cannabis retail, cultivation, and manufacturing in anticipation of that adult use cannabis being legalized in the state starting this week. This kind of builds upon that work that was started last year and makes 4 changes. It institutes some operating hours for both retail uses where you buy the product and on-site consumption areas where you are consuming that product that you just purchased from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. It would require on-site consumption areas to be within a fully enclosed portion of a building. That's to say you wouldn't be able to have a smoking patio, or you wouldn't be able to eat your edible good out on a patio. It would need to be within a fully enclosed portion of a building. It would limit retail in the MXT zone, and I'm sorry, I again have a typo here. This says MXM zone. Limits the retail size in the MXT zone to 10,000 square feet. Retail in the MXT zone of other types, not cannabis related, is limited to 10,000 square feet. So this is kind of a consistency change to make sure that this retail use also is at 10,000 square feet. And then it would also require that if someone's doing cannabis cultivation or cannabis manufacturing, that they need to provide to the city a letter of availability from the Water Utility Authority.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. Any other questions? I would like to move a do pass. Any comments? Motion on and a second for a do pass.
I just have a comment.
Oh, yes, a comment.
Madam Chair, thank you. I will not be supporting this amendment. The hours of operation that are allowed for cannabis retail stores are very limited under this, and there is absolutely no justification for that. We have a lot of businesses that are open late at night. They are also cash heavy. The one rationale that's been put forward for this is that this is going to be a cash heavy business. We do not close down car washes. We do not close down 7-Elevens, and we do not close down bars. And so it seems unfair to me that we would be limiting the hours of operation for this new industry that we're trying to grow into an economic development agent for the city. So I will not be supporting.
Thank you. Councilors, any other comments? All right, I'll call for a vote. Please raise your hand and say aye. All those in favor? Aye. Got it. And
Madam Chair, can you call for the opposed vote, please?
yes, I will. And those opposed? The motion is defeated on a 3-2 vote. Thank you.
Thank you, councilors. Moving on to Amendment A6. This amendment will also not be moved. This amendment proposed to regulate the brightness, externally illuminated signs in proximity to a residential zone district. Council staff has looked a little closer at the lighting section in the IDO and has been working with the planning department and the code enforcement division in particular about lighting in general in the IDO, and truly the entire lighting section needs an overhaul. In lieu of regulating this very specific thing, council staff will be pursuing a contract with a lighting specialist who can give us some advice on the lighting section in the IDO so that we can take a more holistic approach to all the lighting regulations, whether they're from signs or light poles, whatever, to address this issue.
Thank you. Councilor Benton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I appreciate the thought that went into this in the first place, but also appreciate the reset and kind of looking at this as a larger issue. You know, this particular product that was singled out here may or may not be an offensive sign, depending on what it is. You know, a lot of these signs that are basically, we used to just call them can signs in the architect business. If you were doing a commercial development, and this was the lowest common denominator for a sign. It's a box with fluorescent lights inside and plastic covers, and sometimes they really are garishly bright and you know and you know could create problems. Sometimes others are with a darker color, and the letters are not as just bright white or something like that, and they're not offensive. So I think trying to find that medium, and again, I don't love this kind of sign. I'm used to that because I used to have to, you know, I used to have clients that said, well, that's what we're going to put in, and we would put them in. But at the same time, you know, there could be some nuances to this that we might be able to regulate to just make them more attractive and still do their job. So thanks.
Councilors, any other comments? Of course, this legislation was put forth by one of the lights that you and I don't like, Councilor. And it's wreaked havoc in a residential neighborhood. So there are reasons that we need to do these things. But I think I'll defer this until the full council. I can't, I have to move. Make a motion to approve.
Madam Chair, the direction you gave was that this amendment would just not be moved. We would just skip over it.
All right, thank you.
Moving on to LUPS Amendment A7. This is related to self-storage facilities and internal lighting. This amendment would call for any kind of self-storage facility, and you can see an example on the slide. There's a photo of kind of a big bright box that these types of facilities, when located within 200 feet of a residential zone district, need to dim their lights by 50%. The previous amendment that discussed lighting talked about a full-on prohibition of that type of sign. This amendment takes a different approach to lighting and just says you need to turn them down instead of saying you've got to turn them off completely or you can't do the use at all.
Thank you. Are there any questions, comments? I'd move a do pass. This will be number 4. There's a motion and a second for number 4, do pass. All those in favor, raise your hand, please, and say yes. Yes. Got it.
And the opposed?
And those opposed? That passes on a 4-1. Thank you, councilors.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Moving on to LEPS Amendment A8. This is related to the bicycle parking calculation in the IDO. This proposes to amend the calculation for elementary, middle, and high schools. When the IDO was adopted, there was a metric put in there of 3 spaces per classroom. At a recent EPC case this year, a school had to come in for a site plan and had to kind of put this regulation to the test. We hadn't seen a school do that before, so I'm just not sure that we really knew how that calculation was going to play out. And a school that houses about 700 kids was going to be required to provide about 160 bicycle parking spaces. And they testified at the hearing that that metric just seems very unruly and egregious. Anecdotally, they shared that maybe 20 to 25 of their students bike to school, but yet they were going to have to provide 160. So we took a look at this calculation to see if we could come up with something a little more realistic. It is proposed to be amended to 5 bicycle parking spaces or 15% of the required off-street parking spaces, whichever is greater. This type of calculation is more comparable to other non-residential uses in the IDO that have to provide bike parking. And if you were to put this calculation to the test for the previous case I was talking about, instead of having to provide 160 spaces, they would have had to provide about 20 spaces. So this was, I think, a good real-world example where we were able to see an approval come through the city, kind of test a regulation that had gone untested before and realize that it wasn't quite working. I will also note that this will not be applicable to APS schools. APS is not subject to any of our zoning regulations because they're a function of the state. So this is really only applicable to private charter schools.
Thank you. Councilor Benton?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and move the amendment for discussion purposes. I'm not sure that we've got the percentages dead on here, but I do think, given that most of these schools are not APS schools, do draw from all over the city. So they're probably less of a neighborhood school than most schools that APS runs. And I think, this may be appropriate, and I'm a cyclist and I'm a cycling advocate, but I don't think we ought to overdo it, and I would hope that these schools would also just really know their know their audience and know their student population and want to accommodate them. So if a school does have an unusual number of students riding on their bike to school, that they'll deal with it. But so I'm still pouring over in my mind the 15% of required off-street parking spaces. But in the meantime, I guess that we could amend that before the full council if we saw a reason to. So.
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, that's correct. You could pass it tonight and we could amend it at full council. And I'll also note something you alluded to. These are minimums.
Yeah.
And as you said, because they're minimums, a school could choose to provide more if they felt the need.
So I will move a committee amendment. This would be number 5.
I'll second that. Councilor Fubelkorn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also support this concept, but I am concerned about the 15%. With the math that's done in this example that Ms. Schultz gave us, that would give us just the number of spaces that the school needs right now. And as we know, we are trying to get more people on bikes, and so I just have a concern that 15 is a little too low. I would propose a 20% to give us just a little bit of cushion as we move forward with our biking initiatives for the city. So that's what I would be supporting at the council.
So, Madam Chair, if I may, I'll accept that as a friendly amendment. If Do we need to vote on that as a friendly amendment, or can we just, if it's okay with everyone, we'll make it 20% as opposed to 15 for the purpose of this amendment?
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, staff has indicated that we don't need a vote for a friendly amendment. I'll just be clear that the percentage in the red text would change from 15% of required off-street parking spaces to 20% of required off-street parking spaces.
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councilor Sanchez has a comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since it's charter schools, my kids actually attended charter school, and I think that even 15% was reasonable. 20% still sounds reasonable. And the reason I say that is because most individuals who are coming from out of district actually had their parents arrive, drop them off, and pick them up. So there was a very, very small percentage of bicycle use. So I think what we're proposing is totally reasonable. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Sanchez. Any other comments? Councilor Benton?
I just urge your support as amended.
Thank you. All those in favor as amended, raise your hand and say yes. Yes. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you, councilors. Moving on to LUPS Amendment A9. This amendment has been revised since it was initially provided in the packet on March 15th, and since it was redistributed last Friday. I will say the intention of the amendment hasn't changed. Staff has just been able to clarify the language in a way that the planning department might actually be able to enforce this. I'll give you a brief overview of what this does. In the MXL, MXM, and MXH zone districts, if you're wanting to do a townhouse development, which is considered a type of low-density residential development, and you are abutting, so directly next to the right-of-way of a premium transit corridor within the premium transit area, or within a main street corridor, your townhouse development, the front facade of that townhouse development has to face the corridor. That's a kind of convoluted explanation to say that if you're going to build a townhouse in these areas, your front door basically needs to front the corridor instead of your side yard or your backyard, which does not create a very urban environment. And in our premium transit corridors and our main street corridors, we do encourage more urban development. We have seen recent examples in the city where there has been townhouse style development that has been able to put their side yard right up against the street, which means they get kind of a big tall wall right up against the street. And this provision aims to avoid that.
Councilors, any other comments?
I'll go ahead and move this. This would be amendment number 6. And yeah, just to reiterate, a lot of what this is about in these kind of urban conditions is to having eyes on the street for the purposes of security and just vitality of the area. So that's what this is really about. And I think Ms. Schultz described it well.
Thank you, Councilor. Any other comments? There's a motion and a second for a due pass on A9 as amended. All those in favor, raise your hand and say yes.
Yes.
Yes. That passes on a 4-1 vote. Thank you. I'm going to introduce this next one on behalf of Councilor Lewis, who could not be here this evening. A10, Climatic and Geographic Responsiveness. If someone would like to explain what that is, thank you.
Madam Chair, this amendment proposes to strike language in the IDEO related to climatic responsiveness and geographic responsiveness that was put into the IDEO last year. These are two different requirements that call for an analysis if you're doing multifamily development above 20 units or any type of non-residential development except industrial. You would have to provide a climatic responsiveness analysis. And what that asks you to do is to provide a kind of sun and shade analysis on your building at certain points of the year to identify if your building kind of orientation and design is being responsive to the climate. The geographic responsiveness portion calls for an applicant to identify if they're preserving any views of specific features outlined in the section such as the Bosque, the Sandia Mountains, or the Northwest Mesa Escarpment. Councillor Lewis's office heard from the development community about these two requirements, that they don't necessarily have any teeth to them. They do call for an analysis or call for an identification of features that are being preserved. However, if the developer chooses to identify that their building is not being responsive to the climate or is not preserving a view, there's no teeth here for the city to require something different to happen. It's been characterized as a superfluous requirement, and the Ideo tries to not have kind of more policy directed requirements and really tries to have something that can check a box or not. Additionally, there was some data provided that these analyses are not cheap. Particularly, the sun and shade analysis does require someone to 3D model a building in a program like SketchUp, and then run the sun across it at the certain times of day, and that can cost thousands of dollars. If you've got a simple kind of box-shaped building, or an upwards of 10 or 15,000 if you've got multiple buildings or kind of an irregular shaped building.
Thank you. Councillor Benton, any comment?
Yeah, I strongly support this this amendment, and really thought we were on the wrong track when this was passed last year. So it was kind of a feel-good idea, and I even did speak to the first 4 architects who were involved in helping the planning department with this language, and they told me in no uncertain terms it was never their intent that we would do this and then not have any teeth in it, that it would just be something that we would ask a developer, whether they were a humble small developer trying to get it done on a tight budget with an architect having to pay for the time to do this sort of thing, as opposed to something that really would have teeth in it. And I think I would absolutely support something that have teeth in it. That might end up being more like along the lines of part of our building code and our energy code, as opposed to a zoning regulation. And as Ms. Patty Wilson, who's an architect, spoke on this and said, well, any architect or any designer that were essentially, try to paraphrase her, who's worth their salt, would do this sort of analysis on their design. And I agree, they should. But it's very hard to regulate this. And this is not regulation. This is just putting people through hoops and making them spend money with absolutely no ability to enforce it on the city's part. So, you know, I'm sorry for I'll apologize, I guess, I suppose, to my environmentalist friends who think I'm on the wrong side of this and that I'm just on the side of evil developers, but that's not the point. The point is that we're going to do this kind of thing, then let's really make it work, and let's really make it result in a different building form than what this does, which is it doesn't do anything other than put both the applicant and our staff through a bunch of checking of boxes that results in nothing. So I strongly support this amendment.
Thank you, Councillor. And Ms. Schultz, would you tell us, did you have a question, Councilor Peeperkorn? Please do.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to second what Councilor Benton said. You know, I love climatic responsiveness. I think it's really, really important. As you all know, I love energy conservation codes and making sure that we're doing the right thing for the environment. But in the zoning document that is the IDO, this isn't very helpful. And so I will be pushing for this to be included in our energy conservation code, which will be coming up for renewal and updating pretty soon. So for that reason, I'll be supporting this. But it's not that I don't believe that we should be doing, as particularly the sun and shade analysis that is so important to making sure that we minimize the amount of energy used in new buildings. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor Peeperkorn. And Ms. Schultz, please, would you restate what a yes or no vote would do to this particular piece?
Yes, Madam Chair, and staff doesn't have a second logged for this motion. Did, Madam Chair, you move this on behalf of Councilor Lewis? Was there a second? Okay, thank you, Councilor Benton. If this motion passes, there are 2 sections in the IDO that will be stricken in total that require a developer to provide a an analysis or a response to climatic responsiveness, that's the sun and shade analysis, and the geographic responsiveness. So if this is approved, they would not have to provide that as a part of their development applications moving forward.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. Councilors, are there any questions on that? Are we clear? Okay, there is a motion to not pass.
Madam Chair, the motion on the floor is to pass amendment number
Okay.
7.
Okay, there's a motion do pass. All of those in favor, please raise your right hand and say yes. Yes. Opposed? That motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you, councilors. Moving on to Amendment A11. This amendment proposes to overall reduce the number of required minimum number of required off-street parking spaces for multifamily development, general retail development, and grocery store development. This is also being sponsored by Councilor Lewis, and his office heard from a few developers in town who were able to provide him with some metrics about development they have completed in the city recently related to the actual number of parking spaces that are being used by the residents of multifamily. And the more recent multifamily developments are being overparked. This overparking leads to kind of unused asphalt that could be better used by something like more landscaping, potentially more dwelling units. The kind of real world data behind this change is what drove the amendment. For the multifamily portion, I'll say, Councilor Lewis also asked staff to look at our retail parking requirements, and while there weren't any local developers who kind of came to the table and said, you know, we're over parking general retail as well, council staff looked at some kind of sister cities. You can see a list of those on the second page of the amendment and looked at their parking requirement minimums. And the city of Albuquerque is requiring more parking for general retail and grocery stores than some of our comparable cities. And so the numbers that you see in this amendment better reflect what other cities are doing.
Thank you. Councilors, are there any other questions, comments?
Yes, Madam Chair, I have a comment on
Yes.
this one. And this comes from my experience working in and around hotels. I mean, not hotels, but apartment complexes. And what I've noticed, just with my experience, and I don't have to keep saying it, but as a police officer, one of the things that we actually experienced a lot as a police officer is the apartment complexes themselves hiring a tow truck company to go into these apartment complexes, and as long as they signed the agreement, they would get towed. And so what would happen is if you inadvertently lost a registration or it expired, then your vehicle was towed away. What it also caused is it also caused individuals in the surrounding areas or the people in the apartment complex to park their cars outside of the actual gates of the complex, just to make sure that they avoided anything. So instead of parking in the complex, you had people parking outside in the neighborhood areas. So I don't know that this ordinance actually supports enough people that have friends and family. My sister was actually a victim of being inadvertently towed when she went to a friend's house for a birthday party, and it was for a young kid's birthday party on a Friday night. And since there was not enough room in the apartment complex sent the tow truck out there to actually tow all the vehicles that did not belong on the premises, and it was just that Friday night. So it was really a real burdensome thing for my sister to have to try to figure out on a Friday night who the tow truck company was that towed her vehicle, and actually to get that vehicle back, because she had no knowledge that she was going to be towed that night. So I'm not sure how you park 2 cars in 1.8 spaces. So I'd like to get a little more discussion on this, maybe with it, whether it be in the full council or even here today.
Thank you, Councilor Sanchez. Are you moving then to full council without a recommendation? We have to do a yes?
Madam Chair, if the decision of the committee is to not move this amendment forward, I would just recommend that no motion be made. we've had the discussion, and council staff can note that this should be posed at a future either LEPS hearing, if that's the will of the committee, or at the next full council hearing when this item's heard.
Thank you, Councilor Benton.
So, Ms. Schultz, could you address the 1.8? I mean, that's a cumulative, how does that get calculated? And is that rounded up or rounded down?
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, procedurally, we did not have a motion on this amendment.
All right. I'll move it for discussion purposes. I mean, we may not need to vote on it tonight. But
Thank you, and Council Feeble-Corn gave a second.
Okay, great, thank you. So there, you will find fractions of parking spaces in this calculation. However, you end up multiplying that by the number of dwelling units and the number of dwelling unit types. So, you know, say for example, there's a 100 unit apartment complex and all of those units are 3 or more bedrooms. You would take that 100 number and times it by that 1.8, and that would give you your final calculation for off-street parking. I believe that parking calculations in the IDO are all rounded down if there's an occurrence of a fraction. But the kind of tiered system that's presented here tries to get at the fact that as you do increase in the number of bedrooms, you likely will have an increase in the number of cars needed. But the data shown from 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, and efficiency style complexes in Albuquerque is showing that the ratios that are provided here are more accurate to what, you know, people in Albuquerque are actually using.
Thank you. Councilor Benton?
if I could too, we all know that the cost of development is, you know, it's getting more expensive. Land is more expensive, construction is more expensive. And I think in some of these things, some of these uses, whether it's making housing affordable and not using up very expensive land with unnecessary parking. And then in the same sense, when we want retail, especially in some of the retail that we want in our local neighborhood areas where we're trying to get infill retail to serve the community, that that excessive number of parking spaces, again, reduce the likelihood that somebody's going to make some of those projects pencil out and actually occur. So I think it's good to be fine-tuning this in this way.
Any other comments? Yes.
Madam Chair, if I could also address Councilor Sanchez's comments about the requirements for vehicles being registered to park at certain complex parking lots and being towed. That is not something that the city regulates or the IDO regulates. Each individual complex owner or property owner gets to determine kind of the rules for who parks on their property. Sometimes they might require placards, sometimes they might just require an updated registration, but that's not something that this amendment aims to address or that the IDO addresses in any way.
Thank you. Councilors, any other questions? I would like to move then to full council without recommendation. Or
Madam Chair, the motion on the floor is a do pass of floor amendment number 8.
Okay.
And Madam Chair, if I may, since I made the motion, I mean, if there's a discomfort with this the way it is now, I'm fine to leave it in committee and leave it for more discussion. But otherwise, you know, I would be inclined to vote on it.
If the councilors are ready, then let's take a vote on it. If you're all in agreement, okay. There's a motion and a second. Or do approve. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you, councilors. Moving on to Amendment A12. A12 is titled the Safe Outdoor Spaces Amendment. This amendment would create a new land use called Safe Outdoor Spaces and do a couple of things. First, it would identify the zone districts in which a safe outdoor space is appropriate. That would be conditional in the MXT and MXL zone districts, so a conditional use process through the zoning hearing examiner would be required, or permissive in the MXM, MXH, NRC, NRBP, NRLM, and NRGM zone districts. It then goes on to create some use-specific standards about what kind of requirements the city wants to see for these safe outdoor spaces. A couple of examples of those requirements are things like toilets and hand washing stations, fencing requirements, The identification of some services potentially being provided on site, distance separation requirements, that's all outlined in the amendment as well. And lastly, there's a definition created. Because we're creating a new use, we need to define exactly what that use is. You'll see various colored text in your amendment packet. This is indicative of how the amendment has evolved since it was first introduced. Staff has worked really closely with the sponsors and with the community who wants to support these safe outdoor spaces, who want to start doing these safe outdoor spaces. And so there have been a number of changes over time. The most recent changes you will find in green text in your packets. Staff would be happy to answer any specific questions about safe outdoor spaces at the will of the committee.
Thank you. Councilors, are there any questions? Seeing none? Oh,
Madam,
yes, Councilor
yes.
Sanchez.
Madam Chair, I just have a couple of comments in reference to this. I have kind of a little different idea in reference to the homeless that we have here in Albuquerque, and I still see a very large criminal element tied to the homeless community, and I see it every single day of the week. How is there something in here that expressly states that if they violate the laws that we can literally go in there and actually make an arrest? Or how is it set up, the law is the law? And I just want to make sure that if someone's breaking the law while they're in there, that we take care of that.
Madam Chair, Councilor Sanchez, I think that would be assumed for any land use in Albuquerque. If someone is breaking the law, whether it's at a safe outdoor space or at a restaurant or at a bar, that the Albuquerque Police Department has the right to go in and enforce any kind of city law. That is not specifically called out in this use, in a use-specific standard, and that would be abnormal to call out something that applies already to everything in the city.
What if somebody breaks the law, will they be allowed to return? Or were they not?
Madam Chair, Councilor Sanchez, that would be to the purview of the operator of the safe outdoor space, the person who kind of owns that property and is allowing that safe outdoor space to occur on their premises. They have the right to say who gets to stay at those safe outdoor spaces or not, whether that's the city operating a safe outdoor space or a private property owner. That would be under their discretion.
And do we make the rules of the safe outdoor spaces, or is that deferred to the owner as well?
Madam Chair, Councilor Sanchez, that would be deferred to the owner of the safe outdoor space to kind of set forth the rules of, maybe people can only come and go during certain hours of the day. That's all left to the individual operators of these safe outdoor spaces.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Councilor Benton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know that both this and the next amendment of temporary campgrounds are getting a lot of discussion, a lot of questions being asked. I'm not sure that we've got every detail in these perfectly thought through yet. And I think it could stand some more time for the public to look at it and ourselves to look at both of these. So as the sponsor of one of the sponsors of one and the sponsor of the other, I welcome more discussion about it along the lines of the question that Councilor Sanchez asked. But I don't think we're ready to move these to full council yet. I do think there's a need. I think this, and I appreciate the co-sponsors, and I appreciate everyone wanting to be open-minded about this. But I'm getting a lot of questions as one of the sponsors, getting a lot of questions about how's this going to work, when's the first one coming in next door to my house, et cetera. And we do have to be clear about these. Some of us went up to Denver and saw some of these spaces in Denver and how they're being operated. They're just one of many tools that we need to address homelessness and folks who are on the street with, in the case of these extremely low, what we call a low barrier shelter opportunity for people. It's one step from being on a sidewalk essentially, and the folks who are running these in Denver, who are operating them, who are actually the site staff of these facilities are former homeless persons themselves and formerly addicted persons. So they're doing a good job of just recruiting people from the streets into these sites where social services are more readily reachable. They're more reachable with help on these sites, and they can count on a couple of good meals a day at least, usually provided by nonprofit organizations that help out with that. But it's a low barrier, you know, to really understand how these work. We do need to look at these good models, and again, in Denver, that's a big city, and we only saw 2 of them there, and they both were considered to be temporary, and that's why I brought forward the next amendment, which has to do with temporary establishment of such things, because it was kind of the nature of the situation in Denver, that they were happy to find a place where they could do it on a temporary basis, and that space might be developed in the near future, but at that time, it was suitable for the use. So I do think this is a really important component of what we need to be doing in the city. It's just one, though, and it's not a panacea, but it is a step up from the street.
Thank you, Councilor. Any other comments? Councilor Sanchez.
Yes, thank you. Councilor Benton, thank you so much for your insight in reference to this, and I think it's really important that I think we do continue a little more discussion in reference to this. Be nice to get a really nice template, look it over, see what they do. If they have some of these issues, what do they do with the issues where they break the rules or they break the law, or use drugs or alcohol to an extent that that they shouldn't be there, or that they're harming themselves or others. And you know, something like that would actually help. I mean, they already have it in place. They must know what the rules are in reference to what they deal with. So if we can maybe somehow take a look at those and maybe implement some of those rules and regulations here, would really, really help. So thank you for that.
Yes, Councilor Fiebelkorn.
Madam Chair, I have a question. You know, it's been my understanding that the IDEO amendments before us are just allowing safe outdoor spaces, but we are not trying to actually design a program through the IDEO. And so I just want Ms. Schultz to speak to that. You know, this is just an allowance for this type of activity. All the details of how an actual safe outdoor space or a temporary campground would actually run would be the next step in this process. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Councilor Fiebelkorn, yes, this is just setting, you know, the land use rules for if someone wants to do this on the property, what are the minimum requirements that the planning department is going to check for? Any kind of operational requirements, the IDO typically does not dive into that for any land use. We leave that to individual property owners to determine how those activities occur on their site. This does, as you said, just set some really basic parameters and creates it as an option, because you cannot do something like this in our code today. Our code does not contemplate it at all.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. That's a really important distinction to me, and I've gotten a lot of emails and a lot of phone calls recently, you know, wanting to know how these are going to be implemented. And it's just really important to remember that we're just allowing the conversation to start with these amendments to the IDO. All the details could be worked out at a later date. I'm fine with deferring this for, you know, discussion further, but at some point we really do need to move on services for the homelessness population, and this is an important part of that. So I would really like to see it move forward as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Councilor Fiebelkorn. And it's my understanding we're just going to hold it over to the next LUPS meeting and discuss some more.
Madam Chair, there was no motion made to move this as an amendment. It's been just discussion. And so without a motion made, yes, this would be up for discussion again at the next meeting.
Thank you. And Councilor Benton, would you like to make a motion like that for A13? Covered it all?
Madam Chair, I think the course of action is that we're not going to move A13 if that's acceptable to you as one of the sponsors of that one, and then we will not be actually A13 was the one that I'm sponsored, but the one that's labeled A12, we would not be moving either the one labeled A12 or A13 tonight, but rather continue to hear about them and to fine tune them at our next LUPS meeting.
Thank you. That's my understanding too. So
Yes, Madam Chair, Councilors, thank you for the discussion on A12. Staff will be sure to follow up with any councilors who have questions. Councilor Sanchez, we've taken notes on your questions, and we will be sure to sit down with you to talk through those before the next hearing.
Thank you. And Ms. Schultz, do you have some information for us on A13?
Yes, A13 is related to temporary campgrounds. Councilor Benton laid a little bit of the groundwork already for this. It creates a kind of similar use to what Safe Outdoor Spaces contemplated, but on a temporary basis with a couple of different requirements. The temporary nature, I think, is the biggest distinction between Safe Outdoor Spaces and temporary campgrounds. But otherwise, they have a lot of the similar rules related to the requirement for buffering and screening through a 6-foot fence, hand washing stations, bathrooms, etc. And if the committee has specific questions about temporary campgrounds, very similar to the Safe Outdoor Spaces, staff would be happy to try to field those now or follow up after the meeting before the next hearing on these items.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. Councilor Sanchez, do you have any more questions?
I'd like to do the same thing with this one. There's a lot of red and green in here. And it'd be nice to actually go over it a little more with a little finer tooth comb than what we're doing here.
Absolutely. We agree. Thank you, Ms. Schultz.
Madam Chair, Councilor Sanchez, thank you. We will be sure to follow up.
Thank you. Yes, Councilor.
Madam Chair, can I just make one comment on A13? Just for the record, I know I said it last time, but I do have concerns about the barriers that we're placing on particularly A13 and A12. Some of the requirements are onerous. We've heard from some faith-based groups that really want to provide these services to the community, and I'm just worried that it's too hard to set these up. And so as part of that discussion, I'd really like to remember that we've heard from people who literally want to do this as soon as possible at their church or at their community group, and they're telling us that it's too hard. And so I'd just like to make sure that's always in our conversation.
Thank you. We appreciate that very much. This is new ground for all of us. So, Ms. Schultz, if you would like to go to A14.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A14 relates to the vacation of right-of-way process. This proposes to add some text to the procedural direction outlined in the Ideo for when a portion of right-of-way is proposed to be vacated. Staff has heard from some utility agencies that they're concerned about, well, what if there are utilities in that right-of-way that is proposed to be vacated? How does the city help ensure that those utilities that we will still have access to those utilities, that an easement will be maintained? Where does the IDEO address that? The IDEO does not address that today, so the proposed language in red will give some direction to private property owners who are vacating a portion of right-of-way that has a utility, whether it's electric, water, sewer, gas, whatever, that private property owner needs to coordinate with that utility agency to determine the best path forward to ensure that there is still access to those utilities if necessary. It doesn't hold the city to kind of negotiate between that private property owner and the utility agency. The city, in fact, should not put themselves in that position, but instead give some direction to the private property owner to go do that.
Thank you. Good information. I would like to move a do pass on that.
And that is amendment number 9.
Oh, amendment number 9. There's a motion and a second for A14. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say yes. Yes. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you, councilors. Moving on to amendment A15. This is a very technical change to the ordinance itself. All night we've been talking about changes to the IDEO as a document. This is an amendment to the ordinance that adopts the amended IDEO. In the ordinance that was drafted and sent over to the city council, there was some language missing about how the ordinance is to be compiled by the folks who compile any legislation that the council passes. This truly is boilerplate language that every ordinance that the city passes needs to have on it. So this amendment is kind of a technical fix to get that boilerplate language back into the ordinance itself.
Thank you. Any questions? I would like to move a do pass on Amendment 10, which is A15. There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say yes. Yes. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
Madam Chair, councilors, moving on to A16. A16 is a small spreadsheet. I think there's 7 or 8 changes of kind of technical edits to the IDO to improve the clarity of language that exists in the IDO. So this does not propose to add any new regulation, but instead proposes to clarify existing regulation. This spreadsheet is at the request of the Planning Department. These are changes that they didn't catch until after the EPC made their recommendation on this year's IDO annual update. Normally, these types of fixes would be included in the EPC packet, but as the IDO is a massive document, sometimes things just don't get caught until later in the game. So this would propose to adopt technical changes in 7 or 8 places of the IDO.
Thank you. Any questions?
Madam President,
Councilor
I'll
Benton.
move a do pass. This would be Committee Amendment number 11, is that right?
Yes.
I'll move a do pass on this.
And I'll second that. Any conversation?
And Madam Chair, just, for those, we oftentimes hear, well, why are we having to amend this IDO every year? There's something wrong with it. I mean, this is, what's nice about the process that's set up is that it is a scheduled discussion about it every year. And for things like this that we, through just regular use, we find there are aspects that need to be clarified. So I think it's a perfect example of why we do the annual update. And I would point out that in our old system, this didn't occur. This occurred if somebody decided to bring it forward, whether the administration or a counselor, to fix one thing at a time randomly. And that's the way we did it in the past. So, in organizational culture, this is often called continuing improvement process. It's just a continued, always keeping our eye on our system and having it work as best as possible. So, this is a good example of that.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. Ms. Schultz, we're moving on to A16.
Madam Chair, we
Number
need a
8.
vote on the previous amendment. It had been moved and seconded, but no vote has been taken on A16 yet.
You're really messing this up, aren't you? We could move so much faster. Okay, we have a motion and a second on A16. All those in favor, raise your hand and say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Opposed? Raise your hand and say no. Motion carries. On a
Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, can you clarify your vote on that? Were you a yes or a no? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Madam Chair, moving on to amendment labeled A17. This relates to variances and waivers. A property owner can come request a variance or a waiver when they need to deviate from a standard in the IDO if their property cannot accommodate a standard in the IDO. There is specific review and decision criteria that the appropriate body has to consider, and one of them is that the variance or waiver will not materially undermine the intent and purpose of the IDO or the applicable zone district. This amendment proposes to also ask the applicant to consider any overlay zone that they may be in. So if the variance that they're requesting is on a property within an overlay zone, that could be a character protection overlay zone, a historic protection overlay zone, or a view protection overlay zone, that they have to really think of the character that that overlay zone is trying to protect or preserve or maintain, and identify how their variance will not undermine that.
Thank you, Councilor Benton.
Yeah, I'd like to move this amendment, which would be 13, is that? 12, excuse me.
And I'll second that.
And councilors, this came about. This was actually bubbled up from constituents, in this case in the North Valley, who have a character protection overlay, and felt that we needed specific language that wouldn't just let these be willy-nilly changed by minor administrative variances or other type of variances without special consideration of what went into that overlay. So I think it was a really good suggestion. It strengthens the overlay zones as to how people want to see their own individual areas, and it helps make them work better for the neighborhoods.
Okay, any other questions? Then we will take a vote to accept this. All those in favor of accepting this, please raise your right hand and say yes. Yes. Opposed? Same sign. That passes. Thank you.
Thank you, counselors. Okay, we are now on to Amendment A18. I will note for the public that A18, A19, and A20 were not distributed last week. These are new to the packet this week. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, you can access these at abc-zone.com, the website that the planning department manages. You can find these new amendments. A18 proposes to amend the maximum wall height permitted in the front yard or street side yard from 3 feet to 4 feet in residential zones, mixed-use zones, and non-residential zones. This concept first came up at the Environmental Planning Commission. The EPC did consider this request. They heard a lot of public comment on it and ultimately voted that the council should not adopt this. It is the council's right to, propose any amendment, whether the EPC recommends approval or not. And so this one is back for consideration by the committee.
Thank you. Councilor Pena?
So, Madam Chair, I'll make a motion for approval of amendment number, what was it again? 13. And the reason I brought this forward is, just as you know, many areas of the city, southwest area in particular, have a lot of fences that are 4 feet in height, and it's really a safety feature for a lot of neighborhoods. So that's why I brought it forward again. And hearing from a lot of my constituents and other community members throughout the city that, they use this a lot for safety reasons in their communities.
Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, I'm not sure what's an example of what you mean, because we have similar areas, and I'm just as curious as to what you meant, the way it works.
Just hearing from community members, some people are, are being, just the fences are 4 feet high, and some people thought that it was important to have that option of being able to have their fences at 4 feet high, just because of safety reasons. Sometimes, now there's a lot of people kind of jumping over people's fences, getting to the yards, taking things from their yard. A lot of the neighborhoods on the Southwest Mesa in particular are smaller parcels, which unfortunately, sometimes the front yard is a lot of their only yard. So, to ensure that their children are safe playing outside in the front yard and the like.
The only concern I have is, again, from my public safety background, is that I'll tell you, if you need to get in there, it really is nice to have a lower fence, and to jump that fence is a lot easier to jump in a 4 foot or 3 foot fence than a 4 foot fence. And I can tell you that I've jumped many, many, many fences to get into a house that where somebody needs the help, they need the services, and we've had to, sometimes, we've actually literally had to knock fences down in order to get through. And I'm kind of opposed to this one just based on public safety issues.
Councilors, if I may make a comment here, and that is these next topics that were here are only for discussion. They weren't received by our offices until 10 till 5. So we may discuss, or you may simply introduce and however you want to do it, but yes.
Madam Chair, I'd just like to clarify that per the council rules, Councilor Pena is free to move these.
Yes.
My opening commentary was just to alert the public that they might not have seen them yet and where to access them.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought that it was too early to vote on them since we didn't see them either.
Madam Chair, procedurally, there is nothing in the council rules that prohibits that.
Thank you. Councilor Benton, Councilor Fieberkorn first, and then Councilor Benton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a couple of questions. I was not in office when this was originally discussed. To me, 3 feet, 4 feet sounds the same. I have not jumped over a 3-foot fence or a 4-foot fence, Counselor Sanchez, so I don't really know. I'm just wondering if Ms. Schultz could tell me a little bit about the conversation that was had at EPC and what the pros and cons of this kind of change would be.
Madam Chair, Councilor Feeblecorn, the EPC got quite a bit of discussion from community leaders on this amendment. The 3-foot requirement for front yard walls and street side yard walls has been a long-standing requirement in the Ideo, or in the previous zoning code that was rolled over into the Ideo, with the idea that when you have a lower wall in your front yard, you can kind of see what's going on your street from your home. That's a concept called Eyes on the Street. That's part of a larger concept called crime prevention through environmental design. We refer to that as SEPTED. There are SEPTED principles that talk about the way you configure the physical attributes on your lot really can increase the safety. And a 3-foot wall might contribute to that for the reason I just mentioned about being able to have more visibility to your street. It might create less of a haven for someone to hide behind. I think we heard the EPC did hear comments that a 4-foot wall might actually make it easier for a criminal to kind of hide behind if an officer or someone else is roaming the streets trying to look for someone. The conversation at EPC definitely surrounded around kind of maintaining the character so we don't just get a canyon of walls right up against the sidewalk, and the crime element that I think we've heard a couple of different perspectives on.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. And this is just walls, not fences, right? So it's a solid piece of wall, I guess.
Madam Chair, Councilor Feeblecorn, walls and fences are both regulated by this section in the Ideo, so fences would also be required to stay at 3 feet as well.
Thank you. Councilor Benton.
Yeah, I was interested in that. I was going to ask the same question about the IPC discussion, and it reflects my feeling about this. We do have parts of town where there's special overlays, and I believe some areas where we allow taller front yards, if I'm not taller front yard walls, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, there is a procedure already in the Ideo to request a wall that's taller than 3 feet. That's called a wall permit major.
Yeah.
There's a process in which you have to kind of prove that you your lot meets certain conditions.
Yeah.
So it's not that they're totally prohibited from ever happening in the city. You would
Okay.
just have to kind of seek special approval for doing a wall taller than 3 feet.
And I think that's how they came about. Sometimes I think in places, if I'm not mistaken, around Old Town, there might be some of that. But I do think that this question of the neighborhood character, since it has been 3 feet for so long in the front, I think that's an important situation because to consider, because you start burying it, then you're going to have a variation of some people will choose to do the higher wall and some people won't. And it'll be less just consistent as far as the neighborhood. So, and I also do agree with the idea that for in terms of eyes on the street, a 4-foot is going to be provide you from your side, from the home side, looking out with a less clear view of what's going on, and then on the flip side of that, as Councilor Sanchez just said, it could provide more obstacles to public safety and possibly places for people to hide, which is the SEPTED argument also, is that on your sides that face the street, which is the front and a corner side yard, that you want to be able to have the maximum visibility from the home out onto that street. But so I am concerned about this one. I don't know if I'm ready to support it. I think my initial thinking on it is this has stood the test of time for so long. And of course, it doesn't prevent anyone from putting up to an 8-foot tall wall in your backyard if you want to really enclose a space, you know, and that does not face the street. That's still an option. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Benton. Councillor, would you like to speak to this? Councillor Peña?
Yeah, I would just urge your support. This just came from constituents, and, you know, I thought it was important to at least try to move it forward, so.
Thank you, and I appreciate that.
Madam Chair, we didn't have a second noted for this bill. Councillor Peña did make a motion. Can you, what was the second?
I didn't have a second. So if I may, I would like to say, if I may, that because we got this so late and we haven't seen the legislation itself, nor have, I don't think anybody has seen it or read it, I believe that I would like to recommend that we defer it to the next LUPS meeting so that we can read it and know what's going on and have viable input on it.
Madam Chair, again, so when it says that we got it so late, I just hate for that to be out in the public, because it wasn't late, because councilors can submit, and I did submit it in a timely manner in terms of what my deadline would be. So we just won't move the amendment. We don't have to. It doesn't seem like there's any support. So I won't move the amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Peña. And I'm sorry to say so late. It was late for me because I was already down here when it came in, so I'm sorry. And Councillor Peña, you have another piece here?
Madam Chair, A19 relates to neon signs in the city. In the Ideo today, there are pretty specific sign requirements. And if you are doing a neon sign along Central Avenue at specific intersections where Central Avenue crosses other streets, neon signs get bonuses. This is a way to kind of incentivize more neon along the Central Avenue corridor as kind of to encourage the neon character of Central. So where a neon sign might have a certain set of restrictions in one area of town, if you're on Central, you might get to do a bigger neon sign or a taller neon sign. This amendment proposes to allow those bonuses specifically for neon signs everywhere in the city, not limiting it to the Central corridor anymore, but allowing those incentives to be utilized citywide.
Thank you. Councillor Peña?
Thank you. So I would move amendment number, still the same number, right? 13.
Thank you. Councillor Peña, I see no second on that. There is a second from Councillor Sanchez. Any other comments? Councillor Peña, any more?
I'd urge your support. I think Shanna did a great job in explaining the amendment.
Okay. There's a motion and a second for do approve. Let's take a roll on this. For a do approve, please say yes and raise your hand. Or say no and raise your hand. Say yes. All in favor? That is a 2-4. All opposed? No. That fails on a 3-2 vote. Thank you. And Councillor Peña, you also have another piece of legislation?
Madam Chair, there's a little bit of unclarity about the vote on that last amendment. Do you mind if we, for clarity purposes, all those in favor of amendment floor committee amendment number 13, can you please raise your hand for staff and say yes? So there's all those opposed?
No.
Madam Chair, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Councillor Peña?
Madam Chair, moving on to LUPS Amendment A20. This one was provided to you as a standalone piece of paper. You should have it at the dais. This is titled the Ideo Updates. This would add some requirements for when the city does the Ideo annual update process on an annual basis. The planning department submits a packet of proposed changes. This typically comes in the form of a spreadsheet where they outline the section of the Ideo that's being amended, a brief explanation of why the amendment is being posed. The EPC goes on to consider that. The EPC then recommends that whole packet up to the council, and then the councilors can also, as you have seen tonight, pose their own amendments. This document proposes that for every amendment that is proposed, whether it's to the EPC or whether it's by a councilor, that these 11 items of information must accompany each amendment proposed. So that's, basic items such as the page number in the IDO that the amendment is proposing to amend, a justification of the need for the amendment, an explanation of how the amendment benefits the public, an example of the proposed change, a summary statement of the expected impact, such as the number of residents that the change will affect, and any known possible unintended consequences or community risks, verification that any city departments support or oppose each amendment, and all public comments that have been submitted for that amendment with a statement of whether the public supports or opposes that amendment.
Thank you. Councilor Pena, would you like to make a statement?
I'd like to make a motion for approval of committee amendment number 14.
Councilor Benton?
I don't know, was there a second?
No, there was not a second. Do I hear a second? Councilor Pena, I'm sorry, there is no second on that.
So what I'd like to do is just move this so we can have the discussion since there's not a second. This really came from community members. Again, they gave some suggestions. I think they said they shared it with other counselors, hoping that they could, really have the discussion about how neighborhoods are notified and how they're engaged in part of the IDO process. As you all know, since it is an annual update and we have a process in place, sometimes these amendments, like many of the ones that I heard from community members tonight and I put forward, there's just really not necessarily a process. So if they would have all been approved tonight, they would be approved this evening without really the community having that opportunity to give their input. So we really have to have the discussion about how we make sure that there's notification to community members and how we better engage them in the process. So I would actually just hold this and we'll hear it at the next LUPS or council meeting.
Councilor Benton, would you like to make a
Yeah, I'd
comment?
just like to comment. I'm not opposed to the idea here. I'm interested in what the planning department, staff, administration feels about this, whether this would be more difficult, and our staff as well, I suppose, as opposed to
Councilor Benton,
to
Councilor
put you on the hot seat.
Yes, Ms. Shaw.
Madam Chair, I have been asked to note that without a second, discussion on this amendment isn't appropriate.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay. So that fails for a lack of second. Thank you, Councilor Pena. And is that? It isn't going to be heard.
Madam Chair, that concludes all of the amendments for tonight's presentation. The council, or the committee, I'm sorry, did move nearly a dozen of the amendments tonight, so you will not have to rehash those at a later date unless you so choose. So at this point, you are able to either defer the entire bill as amended to the next LUPS hearing or any future LUPS hearing, or move it to full council.
What is the will? Councilor Benton.
I'll make a motion to defer the bill as amended to the next LUPS hearing.
And I'll second that. There's a motion and any comments? Motion and a second to defer until the next LUPS meeting.
Madam Chair, if you could specify that motion is to the April 13th LUPS meeting.
There's a motion and a second to defer this till the April 13th LUPS meeting. All those in favor, raise your hand and say yes. Yes. Opposed? That motion carries. Thank you. I think we have gotten through this long, complicated piece of material tonight. Thank you all for being here, and see you on the 13th.